Radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan. Voice of the Eagle, kami di mapipigil sa pagbabalitang tumpak at tama. Buhay Atenista, sa loob sa labas ng eskwela, ating ibibida lahat ng eskwela. Radyo, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, Katipunan. Kawal ni Ignacio, Katipunero sugo, todo sa kayod, tunong at tulong. Lipad na Blue Eagle, galing giting at tigil, blue and white, one big fight. Radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan.
Meron? Ano nga ba ang meron? Paano nga bang mabuhay ng tapat sa meron? Don't you wish you can relive your Philo classes? The terror teachers? The terrible oral exams? Or the even terrifying but liberating and life-changing aha moments? Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Here's your chance! Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Kasama ang mga pilosopong sina Jovy Miroy at Capinding. Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Leaping upward, leaping forward. Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Leaping to greater heights, to greater wisdom, to greater magis. Lundag na, Ateneo!
Hi, it's me again, Dr. Jovy Miroy, without Sir Ron Capinding, because this is the second episode of the series at the Philosophy Department Plenary Content on the emotions and being human. Last week we had emotions in the philosophy of being human of Aristotle, and this week will feature the philosophy of Rene Descartes. And as you know, Rene Descartes is a French philosopher, belongs to the modern period. Before we go to the PowerPoint presentation, we would like to acknowledge the comment of one of our listeners saying that perhaps the overuse of the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven was distracting. So we're refraining from doing that this week, just to show you how valuable your comments are to us. So we welcome them, and we shall try our best to accommodate your suggestions. And so, without further ado, we'll present to you the philosophy of being human of Rene Descartes and his synthesis, or his view of the emotions as well. But you know, Rene Descartes has something in common with all of you, because Rene Descartes studied with the Jesuits at the Flèche College in France. So having said that, we'll go to the PowerPoint presentation prepared and to be read by no less than Rafa Lavinia.
Have you ever been overcome with emotions? Let's say you and a friend are fighting about something that they did. You're so angry that you threaten to end your friendship with them if they don't apologize. They say that you are being irrational and blowing things out of proportion. How should you respond to that situation? Or imagine a person with an extreme fear of flying. She knows that plane crashes rarely happen and that the chances of dying in a car are higher than dying in a plane. However, despite this knowledge, she refuses to fly and is overcome with feelings of fear and anxiety at the thought of it. These situations raise a few questions. What is the relationship between emotions and rational thinking? Do emotions have any value, or do they only get in the way of good decision making? In a discipline like philosophy, which centers rationality, there is a tendency to ignore emotions, or worse, treat them as pathological. If the emotions have been neglected in the Western philosophical canon, it may be argued that the modern tradition, inaugurated by Rene Descartes, should bear some of the blame. The Cartesian turn towards the human being as a thinking thing precipitated an increased focus on the rational dimension of human existence. For better or worse, this focus on rationality came at the expense of the emotional dimension of human existence. However, whatever the consequences of the Cartesian turn may have been, Descartes himself cannot be accused of not grappling with the question of emotion. While he is best known for his work grappling with epistemic questions about the possibility of certain knowledge, Descartes does attempt to make an account of the emotions repeatedly throughout his work. That said, his theory of emotions cannot be understood separately from his broader ideas about human knowledge and the relationship between the mind and the body. This podcast will focus on key ideas in the Cartesian account of emotions, beginning with an exposition of the mind-body distinction that will serve as foundation for this account. In his Meditations of First Philosophy, Descartes attempts to search for an indubitable point for human knowledge, an epistemic foundation that would give him some level of certainty in his beliefs. This search for certainty came in a time of immense change in Western European society. The epoch in which Descartes was born into was characterized by the Reformation movement, the invention of the printing press, and the heliocentric revolution, among other significant historical ruptures from pre-Renaissance society. Given all this change, Descartes was forced to ask, what can I be certain of? Descartes begins his search with his senses, on the observation that sense perceptions are the source for most of our knowledge. I know that the chair in front of me exists because I can see it with my eyes and touch it with my hands. Yet, Descartes points out that in our concrete, everyday experience in the world, our senses err. I might think that I saw my friend waving hi to me from a distance, only to find out that it was a complete stranger waving at someone else. I can mishear a key concept in my philosophy teacher's lecture, leading me to completely misunderstand the lesson. My sense of smell may tell me that someone is cooking my favorite meal in the other room, only to be bitterly disappointed when I check and see that it is something else. Not only can our senses fool us, but they often do. To make things even worse, the experience of dreaming can make all human sensory experience subject to doubt. When we dream, our senses fool us into thinking we are experiencing something that we are not. It is only after we wake up that we become cognizant to the fact that our senses were off base. Descartes' coup de grace in his universal methodic doubt is the invocation of this evil genius. Despite the aforementioned doubts about the truth value of his sense perceptions, Descartes points out that even the misrepresentations fed to us by our senses still seem to have their basis in things that exist. Even if I were to dream of an outlandish creature with a human torso, lobster claws, a snake head, and a horse's lower body, the parts of the creature still come from things that do actually exist. Furthermore, subjecting our senses to doubt still leaves us with simple and abstract concepts that can be found in fields like arithmetic and geometry. After all, 1 plus 1 is always equals to 2, no matter what our senses tell us. Isn't it? This leads Descartes to positing the idea of an evil genius, a malevolent, omnipotent being that dedicates all of his energies to deceiving us. If this being did exist, by virtue of its omnipotent and malevolent nature, then all of our sense perceptions, our basic intuitions, and even seemingly self-certifying propositions in fields like math are now doubtable. After going through the gauntlet of his universal methodic doubt, Descartes discovers his indubitable point of certainty in the idea of the human being as a thinking thing. Even if I were to assume the existence of this evil genius who is deceiving me, that cannot do away with the fact that I exist as a subject who is being deceived, who is doubting, and who is thinking. I can doubt the existence of the objects I see before me and even the existence of my body. What I cannot doubt is that there is a subject that is doubting, that is having and engaging with these perceptions, that can affirm, reject, conceive, and understand. Although Descartes would later attempt to rebuild his epistemic faith in the senses and abstract concepts through his argument for the existence of a benevolent God, the discovery of the human being as primarily a thinking thing marked a philosophical split between the body and the mind. In the Cartesian account, the human being is fundamentally res cogitans, a thinking thing. Knowledge is gained through the understanding of clear and distinct ideas apprehended by the mind. The body is relegated to a place subordinated to the mind. This begs the question, what is the relationship between the mind and the body? How does the mind affect the body, and vice versa? In his final work, The Passions of the Soul, Descartes gives a fuller account of the role of emotions in mediating between the body and the mind. He uses the word passion in its more technical sense, something which is received or undergone. Emotions are passions of the soul insofar as they act on our soul, moving it towards and away from certain directions. To be more precise, Descartes defines passions as, quote, those perceptions, sensations, or emotions of the soul which we refer particularly to it, and which are caused, maintained, and strengthened by some movement of the spirits. In categorizing the passions as a, quote, perception, Descartes seems to already be commenting on the fact that they can be just as misleading as other kinds of perceptions, like our senses. According to Descartes, passions, quote, move and dispose the soul to want for the things for which they prepare the body, end quote. The soul is acted upon by these perceptions from the body. In his account, this happens primarily through the operations of the pineal gland, what Descartes considers to be the bridge between the body and the soul. Because passions are the result of the body acting upon the soul, they are often muddled up, confused, incorrect. It is a task of the rationality to rein in and clarify these passions. So what added value do emotions have in our lives? For Descartes, the function of emotions is fundamentally motivational. Emotions themselves are not bearers of truth value, but they function to give us guideposts in living our everyday lives. Insofar as emotions can confuse and mislead us, Descartes concedes that they ought to be reined in by rationality. That said, Descartes does not go as far as to say that emotions are pathological. Emotions guide our mind towards knowing what is good and not good for our body. For example, the emotion of hatred has an aversive character, which will lead us to stay away from the things which we hate because they cause our body pain or discomfort. Conversely, love has an appetitive character that will lead us towards the things that we love because they cause us pleasure. In these cases, emotions move us to doing or not doing certain things. The challenge for Descartes is in clarifying these emotions and making sure that they do not get out of hand or lead us astray. For better or worse, emotions are a driving force in the life of a human being. The next song is Emotion by Carly Rae Jepsen. In this song of desire and want are framed as an animating drive. In this song, the emotions of desire and want are framed as an animating drive, a source of energy for the things that the persona and her object of desire could do if they were together. This reflects the motivational force of emotions.
Be tormented by me, babe. Wonder how I do. How's the weather? Am I better now that there's no you? Drink tequila for me, babe. Let it hit you cold and hot. Let your feelings be revealing that you can't forget me. Not a flower on the wall. I am going 10 feet tall. In your head and I won't stop until you forget me, get me now. In your fantasy, dream about me, and all that we could do with this emotion. Fantasy, dream about me, and all that we could do with this emotion. This emotion, I feel it. This emotion. You feel it, all that we could do with this emotion. Paint a picture for me, boy, with the skies forever blue. Tell me there is nothing I can't have and nothing you won't do. Toss and turn without me, boy, let it hit you cold and hot. All my kisses and you miss it and you can't forget me. Not a flower on the wall. I am growing 10 feet tall. In your head and I won't stop until you forget me, get me now. In your fantasy, dream about me, and all that we could do with this emotion. Fantasy, dream about me, and all that we could do with this emotion. This emotion, I feel it. This emotion, you feel it. All that we could do with this emotion. What if I turn the lights right down? I feel it. What if I turn the lights right down? You feel it. You and me in the dark right now. I feel it. In your fantasy, dream about me, and all that we could do with this emotion. Fantasy, dream about me, and all that we could do with this emotion.
That was Emotion by Carly Rae Jepsen. So, our interview portion is going to feature one of the most illustrious members of the philosophy department. Rene Descartes always reminds me of my teacher in modern philosophy when I was studying philosophy, and that is Dr. Ramon Reyes. Now, someone else is teaching that course, Modern Philosophy, and he is right here with us. He is no less than Dr. Oscar Bolaong. Hi, John.
Hi, Jovy. Thank you for having me here.
All right. John, were you familiar with that song of Carly Rae Jepsen?
No, but I brought the lyrics up here to my laptop and I saw it. I like it. I think I'll be playing it tonight going home.
Uh-huh. All right. So the subject matter of emotions in Rene Descartes is found in which work of his? Which work of Rene Descartes?
Passions of the Soul.
The Passions of the Soul. Do you recommend that we read that book?
It's not
That
required
work,
in the modern philosophy
yeah.
course, Jovy, but yeah, of course. I mean, that's a very comprehensive book in which Descartes articulates and tries to unpack how he understands how the perceptions affect the mind.
All right.
In fact, he even says that there are six. I think he says that there are six basic passions. He says wonder,
what are they?
love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness.
What's that again?
Wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness.
All right. So, what are your thoughts on the way that emotions and rationality are often dichotomized? They're often split together. Huh?
Yeah.
Emotions and rationality. Is this found only in the Cartesian system, or not even in the Cartesian system? This split between thinking and feeling. Yeah.
Jovy, is it okay if I bring in some context and background first?
No, by all means.
I think the history of philosophy will bear out that emotions have not been relegated to an inferior position. I think it's it's a history of psychology, I think, where there's a normative assessment of functioning well, and how they have attributed dysfunction. Psychology in particular has attributed dysfunction to emotions. But if we look at the history of philosophy, I think emotions, this dichotomy is fairly represented. Let's not forget that after Descartes branched out rationalism and empiricism. A philosophy major will recall that the rationalists are represented by Spinoza, Leibniz, and Descartes. I think the next session will be on Spinoza. Yeah. The empiricists, on the other hand, are represented by Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Let's keep in mind that when we talk about empiricism, that's basically the claim that sense experience is the ultimate source of all concepts and knowledge. In fact, in particular, Hume, after Descartes, David Hume, this British philosopher, says that he talks about moral sentiments, and he claims that moral sentiments are the ultimate standard for moral judgments. So I wanted to make a comment about the dichotomization, that when we say when we ask that question, is it a fair dichotomy, we're really coming from a psychological framework in which we've already judged emotions to be inferior. Can I continue? I wanted to talk about the contribution of Descartes in this context, and how we can think of the balance between emotions and rationality. I wanted to thank Rafa. That was a wonderful exposition on Descartes' universal methodic doubt. Congratulations, Rafa. That was that would have been an A in an oral exam, I think. Let's not forget that what I wanted to point out as a significant place of Descartes in the history of philosophy is that I think he's the progenitor of modern humanism. When I say he's a progenitor of modern humanism, I'd like to make the distinction between the pre-modern medieval epoch and the modern. One of the most significant shifts there is a shift from the authority of the divine and supernatural to interiority. What Descartes, in fact, really contributes when, as Rafa described earlier, when he articulates res cogitans, he's really articulating interiority. He's shifting the attention to interiority. In fact, he says, from here on, the starting point of philosophy, of knowledge, of morality, of even aesthetics will begin, the starting point will be consciousness. The starting point is interiority, and it puts the supremacy of the self to fore. So that's the res cogitans in that case paves the way for key themes of proceeding epochs. So I wanted to use a concrete example just to bear that out. No, I mean a man in medieval epoch, for example, is asking himself, what kind of career, what kind of life should I live? It's very likely that medieval man will go to his priest and ask the question, what is my place in this big hierarchy of the universe? Humanism, and I'm saying that Descartes is a progenitor of this, he made possible humanism, is that shift so that when you have a modern, whether it's modern or contemporary man or woman who asks the question, well, how should I live my life? What should be my career? What's my place in the world? The direction is no longer external. It's no longer asking God, what's my place here? It's oftentimes our impulse in the modern period is to ask the question interiorly. And so we ask, what's my authentic self? What does it mean? How do I feel about? What are my innermost feelings, and what are my feelings about certain careers, and so on and so forth. So it's with that example about the shift that I wanted to give emphasis to, because it's important that we understand that Descartes' place is that shift. He made possible that shift.
The subjective turn. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a perfect word for it.
All right. So, but then the emotions still play a role in that subjectivity.
In that subjectivity. Mm-hmm. And
insofar as that they guide the human being in navigating the world, or
absolutely. But like I said, I'm wondering, Jovy, if you agree with this. I'm making a judgment that it's the normative character of psychology that gives importance to function versus dysfunction that gives us our contemporary notion. I like the examples that that Rafa gave earlier. He said, if you're very, very angry and someone tells you, well, you're being irrational, and the implicit message there is you're being carried away by your emotions, itself is a normative assessment. It's an assessment already of what's functional, what's a functioning person and a dysfunctional person. So there's already, I think, an ethical perspective to be considered when we dichotomize emotions and rationality.
So in Descartes, although there is a mind-body distinction or split, in other words, since there is such a subjective turn, and therefore the body seems to be a kind of there's a kind of unconsciousness or the body seems to be separate from your real self, which is your mind or the cogito. Does that mean that there is no more space for the emotions in Descartes?
I think that's really a consequence of the universal methodic doubt. And by consequence, I mean maybe it's an unintended consequence. I don't think Descartes set out to alienate the consciousness from the res extensa. We make the distinction between res cogitans and res extensa. Res extensa would be the body, the external world, and then the consequence of the res cogitans when he says cogito ergo sum cogitans, the consequence of that is solus ipse, if we remember from our lectures previously. Solipsism is that I am alone, this consciousness is alone. I don't think he started out intending that to come upon that problem. And in fact, that's precisely the problem. That problem of the bridge, I think, is what we usually call that problem between the mind in the context of the mind-body duality. In that context, there were philosophers after Descartes, and Descartes himself tried to solve that problem, tried to bridge that problem between the mind and the external world. He at no point, I think, should we stay only with solus ipse, meaning I don't think we should reduce Descartes to having distinguished and then divorce the mind from the body. I think this was a consequence. He recognized the consequence, and he tried to solve it in the preceding chapters of the meditations, the preceding meditations 3 to 5, for example. And rationalism precisely is also an attempt to solve that problem of the bridge, and empiricists also were philosophers who attempted, and in different ways. No, so I would like to give emphasis to the impulse and effort that people put into attempting to bridge that division between mind and body.
Yeah, but where does the emotion, where do emotions fit in that whole equation?
As Rafa mentioned earlier, you remember that emotions here are to be understood as motivational, as impulses. I brought a book with me just because I like the title.
Sure.
The title of the book is Passions of the Western Mind by Richard Tarnas. We use articles, some portions of the book in some of the classes that we have. Take note of the title, diba? It's Passions of the Western Mind. I like the attempt to combine both emotions and mind in this context. So you'll notice that I'm trying to avoid staying with the distinction because I think it's an artificial distinction between rationality and emotions. I think I'd rather pay attention to the efforts of philosophers, and I think it's a very human effort as well. In our everyday lives, we understand these two things as distinct, of course, but when we act in our daily lives, when we make decisions, I think it's hardly the case when a person says, I'm purely rational, because in that case I would be a robot, or I'm purely emotional when I make a decision, because that would simply be being an animal. I think in our everyday lives we continue to make that effort to bridge the two.
But is there a sense in Descartes wherein the emotions shouldn't be overwhelming? There's a kind of a desire to make them less overwhelming, or
I think in many portions of that text that we talked about earlier, the passions of the soul, he mentions, but the thing is, Jovy, like I hope you don't mind that I'm pointing out that even the word overwhelming is already coming from a psychological perspective where we make the judgment about what is to be overwhelmed means the rationality is overwhelmed, I assume. And when the rationality is overwhelmed, what happens there is there's dysfunction. I think that's the implicit meaning of that. I think in our everyday lives, and I think it will be borne out in the book Passions of the Soul, where Descartes talks about each of those basic emotions and talks about the value of each one of those, and he doesn't have that sense of. In my reading, he doesn't give. I don't get the impression that he talks about from a normative perspective. He's really talking about the passions in a descriptive mode, I think, rather than in a normative mode. So I'm bringing back the comment. What do you think? I mean, what's your opinion about that, Jovy?
Well, I haven't read Descartes enough to have an opinion, but maybe what we can ask is, what do we do when the emotions do carry us? We get carried away by our emotions. Yes. There is already the distinction that is, between passion and emotion, or the motivational aspects, and the passions would be different from the emotions motivating us. You understand what I'm saying? That there's a sense that the passions would be that your emotions are leading you, but the motivation would be the emotions guiding you.
Emotions guiding you.
But could there be a distinction between the two?
I think when we nuance it that way, that we make the distinction between passion and emotion, yes, I can imagine how a kind of moral psychology can be developed. I don't see how Descartes clearly. No, sorry. I don't think Descartes makes that distinction. I think he remains with the descriptions of the passions as motivators. But in our modern and everyday lives, I think it will be a helpful distinction to make, that the passions would motivate us, and I think that, Jovy, is it correct? The root word of passion is paskain. Is that, if I remember correctly?
No. Passion comes from it's the infinitive of the deponent patior, which is pati, and then the perfect form of that is passus.
And the translation is
something that I undergo or suffer.
Yeah, to suffer. I think the paskain, the spelling I'm thinking about, also means to endure or to suffer. So
to suffer, to undergo, or to suffer.
To endure. I want to add the word endure, because to suffer or to undergo something is to endure it, to have to go through it.
Yeah, that's why we call it the passion and death of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's nice. And in that context,
but then he actually uses the word motivation, which is different from the. So what would be the emphasis that he puts in the idea of motivation, instead of just undergoing something?
Instead of just undergoing, in that context, these would be sentiments that the distinction is not clear to me, Jovy. So I'm only understanding it from a psychological perspective, and I can imagine how as I was saying earlier, how a moral psychology, that is, would distinguish between sentiments, perceptions, would distinguish all of these faculties, where each of these things would have a place, where the passions, as you describe, would be the motives, and the emotions. There would be a certain place of these different things that we undergo and suffer, that make us continue to exist in the world.
All right. Yeah. Maybe as a kind of conclusion would be that while it is clear that Rene Descartes is a philosopher of the consciousness of the thinking being, it didn't mean that he didn't reflect on the emotions, the passions, and its place in that whole system that he was building, and this understanding of the self. And I think maybe we can invite our viewers and our students to do the same. While we are called to be conscious and to be subjective, the emotions are always there to tell us that maybe there's also that other movement of going out, that of moving out, that motivation, which is very, very important for Descartes as well, which is action. So that the cogito, while it thinks, it must also act in the world. And I think at the very end, he has imbibed the Ignatian spirit of action.
Very nicely put.
So having said that, we'll go back to Rafa, who has suggested activities to all of you.
In line with that idea of interiority, this is a short mindfulness exercise intended to help us become conscious of the things that we feel and the things that we are moved to do with these feelings. So just find a comfortable position. Take a minute of silence with particular focus on your breathing, and ask yourself what emotions you are feeling in that moment. Name them. Take a minute to do this. Afterwards, while remaining silent and focused on your breathing, note in your mind what these emotions are moving you to do. Take another minute to do this in silence and with focus on your breathing. Okay. After all of this, you can write down in your journal what the observations you made were. What were the emotions that you felt in that moment of silence, and what did they move you to do?
Wonderful. So with that, we'll leave you to your mindfulness exercise, and we look forward to being with you again next week, where we talk about Spinoza. In the meantime, keep smiling.
Playing catchphrase. Put in the rhythm.
Meron? Ano nga ba ang meron?
Next week.
Paano nga bang mabuhay ng tapat sa meron? Don't you wish you can relive your Philo classes? The terror teachers? The terrible oral exams? Or the even terrifying but liberating and life-changing aha moments? Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Here's your chance! Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Kasama ang mga pilosopong sina Jovy Miroy at Capinding. Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Leaping upward, leaping forward. Lundagin Mo Beybeh! Leaping to greater heights, to greater wisdom, to greater magis.